Welcome to the Weekly Squeak, your weekly geeky squeak with me, as always, Chris Chinchilla. Hope everybody is well. This week I have an interview with Jon Edvald of Garden, a cloud-native automation platform, actually based here in Berlin, quite small and early stage, but an interesting space nonetheless. Hope you will hold on through my links for that. This will be the last few episodes of the Weekly Squeak before I change things a little bit. I think I'm going to have 2 more shows after this, and I'm going to change the format a little bit. So watch and listen and read to this space for updates there. But first, here are my links of the week. All right, so first on Computer World, Greg Kaiser. Google to cut off other Chromium-based browsers from access to services such as Sync. I also saw some other stories about this coming out today, especially in the Linux world, and what this means. So Google Chrome, as you can see from the big icon here, if you're looking at the video, is actually based on an open source project called Chromium. And other Chromium-based browsers are Brave, Edge, I think Opera now, actually basically anything apart from Firefox and Safari. And up until this point, they've leveraged a lot of frameworks and APIs. And Google doesn't necessarily have an issue with those, but it has an issue with getting ads popping up all over the place. It has an issue with people using Google-specific APIs. And you can see here like Chrome Sync, Click to Cool, and a few other things. And they're going to shut off access to those. I would actually imagine that the Sync one is probably the one that will cause people the most issue. I know Brave spent a long time making a sync mechanism that worked, and I was always wondering if they maybe just ended up using the Google one instead. I'm not 100% sure about that. I hope that's not true, but it's hard to say. So from March the 15th, any of these private Chrome APIs will be blocked. And yeah, I think this specifically affects a lot of the Linux community and people who want to use Chromium with a bit of Google magic, but not a lot of the Google magic. So we'll see what happens there. And it's also kind of an interesting precedent for other open source projects that maybe have a similar relationship with the better known upstream, downstream projects. Next, somewhat related. This is actually on 6 Colors by Jason Snell. Safari 14 added web extension support. So web extension being a somewhat standard way of writing extensions for Chromium-based browsers, and I think also Firefox, and also Safari since Safari version 14. So why have people not really made that many extensions, which I can attest to? And so a few have made it. PocketTube, OneTab, which is quite a popular extension, and a few others, but not that many. Beyond 20, so that's actually one I use when I'm doing D&D live streams. People said they're not going to bother. Firstly, just because it supports those the framework doesn't mean that the APIs it needs are there. And he actually says, the developer of that particular extension even says that Microsoft have contacted him about making a version for Edge, and he hasn't done that either. And there's also things like, I would imagine that even if web extensions framework is supported, you still have to wrap a Safari extension in an Xcode project. And of course, not every developer has access to a Mac and Xcode. So yeah, I've actually been thinking about this myself because there's a couple of open source Chrome extensions. I've thought, maybe I could convert them. And of course I could, but yeah, it's not as easy as it may initially seem. Just because the Web Extensions API is supported doesn't necessarily mean everything that these extensions use is supported. So if anyone's tried, I'd be quite interested to know if any of you have tried to create Safari extensions and what the experience is like. And would this help you at all? Not really help at all? And are the other negatives actually outweigh this positive? Another one in the open source-ish world. This has been relatively large news. I actually attended quite a good webinar on the subject yesterday as well. So this is from Stephen J. Vaughan Nichols on ZDNet, Elastic, changing the open source license to monetize cloud service use. Companies like Elastic and Mongo have been at the forefront of this battle against AWS because most of them make their money from cloud-based hosting of their services, and when AWS just come along, and others, but AWS is one of the worst in this regard, and take their business, how can they keep maintaining the open source project? And equally, Amazon has also forked versions of these projects before and then just kept their own going. And sometimes it's kind of been better. Sometimes Amazon and AWS have more engineers than the actual original companies. So, yeah. And I did see quite a good webinar on this from CoreLogix yesterday. So you can also have a look on their website to find that. Quite an in-depth discussion about it. And this has been the source of much controversy in the open source community. So now Elastic have created another new license, and I think they had one before, and so did Mongo. This is called the server-side public license and the Elastic license. And a lot of people use Elastic and the various projects they maintain. And they constantly say that it doesn't really have any impact on many people. It only really has an impact on people who then try to monetize their services through that. So in this particular instance, the Amazon Elasticsearch service is not particularly hiding things there. And various others as well, also on Azure and Google Cloud. But in the interesting difference there is often it's Elastic providing those services and there's some kind of option there, whereas AWS has a tendency to just kind of do it and not really work in collaboration. So this will be an ongoing saga. I think a lot of these companies are these sort of older, quote unquote, open source companies are struggling a little bit with this and don't really always know what to do. And sometimes the open source community reacts badly, the commercial community reacts badly, pretty much to whatever they do. So it's hard for them to really win or lose, but they're still expected to keep maintaining the open source project. So what do you do? It's an interesting constant problem that will probably only get worse as we move forward. So yeah, any thoughts on that? I'd like to hear from you. So christianschiller.com, and you can find some contact details there, or just leave a comment wherever you saw, heard, or read this newsletter. Another open source article, another following of topics I've been covering for some time. This was an Ars Technica from Samuel Axon, but was also quite widely reported. Ubuntu is running on M1 Max. From Corellium or Sorellium, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. This is actually a company that had some history with Apple. They also made an iOS security testing tool, and Apple sued them. So I don't think that it will happen in this case, but they obviously have quite a history of trying to work with Apple hardware and make different things happen with it. So the caveat here is a lot of the drivers are not supported for some of the various hardware components because Apple is never going to open source those. So what do you do about them? But still, it works at a basic level. It'd be quite interesting to know where this goes from there. And that is basically about it. It's on GitHub right now, so you can go and try and download the kernel and do what you like from there and see what happens. It's definitely something you want to just do on a USB stick for kicks and giggles, not really for running any production work, but we'll see what happens from now on. And finally, my and finally section. This is actually from a couple of years ago. This is on the playlist from the playlist staff, apparently. But this has come up in one of my film watching groups, and I'm a huge fan of most of John Carpenter's work, not all of it. So here's a great article about a full retrospective of some of his films, including quite a few I'd never heard of, which was interesting to hear. I also highly recommend his soundtracks. He has some great soundtracks, and he actually just released a new album late last year, and I think he's in his 80s. It's actually very, very nice, focused music for writing to. I highly recommend it. So if you want some introductions to John Carpenter from 1974 all the way down to, I think his last film was 2010. And then he gave up because that film was not very well received. And he definitely had his heyday in the kind of 80s, I think. But have a work your way through some of those. Most of them are available on common streaming services. Not everything, but most. And some of my favorites, you can, if you're watching the video version, you can now see I'm highlighting on Assault on Precinct 13. I love that film. It's a kind of wonderfully dark film where just something happened and it's never really explained why, which I kind of like. And that was my links for the week. Now here's my interview with Jon Edvald of Garden. Enjoy.
Sure. My name is Jon, which is Icelandic for John. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Garden. So I'm an engineer by background and by trade, but been in like various management roles over the last few years. Garden is my second startup. Back in 2007, started a different company out of Iceland with a different group, but doing a different sort of a thing, like natural language processing, analyzing online discussion. Ran that for about 5 years. There was a CTO, not the CEO, so that's a new hat for me. Went, I'd say, fairly well. Was acquired by a company called Jive Software, we joined when they were still rising, and they've since hit on harder times. And that actually, so that was a great experience for me. Both, going from a small Icelandic startup, joining at the time 600 person public US company, like big enterprise B2B operation. So learned a lot of things about how that whole thing works, the sales side of things, and also learned how not to go from what was at the time, I think, a 13-year-old Java monolith to the brave new world of what was then commonly referred to as SOA, or service-oriented architectures. And now, yeah. So now, what basically we refer to as microservices today. Also, cloud wasn't really a thing when that company started, and they were always kind of on the fence. They ran their own data centers, so they were like, do we for these like big Fortune 500 enterprise clients, like, are they comfortable with being in the cloud? That's all changed a lot since then. So now that seems like a no-brainer. Yeah. So that's kind of where I started to get really interested in the challenges of developing microservices, distributed systems in general. Ahead of that, at my startup, in the early days, we ran servers out of a cabinet at the office. We did have a good internet connection, first at the university and then in this innovation center. And so things have changed a lot in the years since I first started doing, full-time professionally, dropped out of university to start a company. I'm typical that way.
And you're the fifth Icelandic person I've met in Berlin.
There's quite a lot of us here. So three of us here at Garden on the founding team. We're just added a fourth.
Some of the others I've met. I don't think so.
Yeah. No, I think there's probably like 1,000 Icelandic people in Berlin. I think it's a very common. Iceland is a very small country. It's like 330,000 people, I think, at the moment, so Berlin is a kind of a good step up. It's a cheaper place to live. I see lots of artists moving here, more and more in tech. My friends over at Clang Games. I don't know if those are some of the people that you know.
No, but I would confirm that. I mean, not wanting to go too far down that path, but when I first got here in 2015, even there was not really proper tech. It was always like e-commerce and B2B tech and stuff like that. And then very rapidly became, I think I worked for one of the very few proper tech companies, and now there's loads.
I don't know how you're qualifying that, but I think I know what you mean. I guess tech is a kind of a vague term these days. So
Exactly. I know what I mean. I don't like it when tech companies when companies call themselves a tech company, you're like, no, you're just using technology. But I would consider Garden a tech company. We haven't actually spoken about what it is you do yet. So what is Garden doing?
Yes, I'm kind of meandering towards that part of the story. So Garden, we help companies with the challenges around developing distributed systems, microservices, specifically focusing on cloud native, i.e. Kubernetes applications today. So working with containers and deploying on Kubernetes. So the way it came to be, so previously I was VP of engineering at Clue here in Berlin. And, we, at the time, like somewhere between 50 and 60 people. When I joined, it was actually with the intent of working with the data science team. And then we realized, actually, there's barely a backend engineering team. And yet, we had 1 million and something daily active users and lots of critical data. And so I took that on, started to grow a team around that, and went through the transition from just simple Node.js Heroku backend into containers. Brief stop at Docker Cloud before we just kind of came to understand that they had stopped developing it, and Kubernetes was managed.
Yep.
They didn't really tell us. I think, that was kind of the hard part of the transition. And then we moved on to Kubernetes, and getting it working, deployed, running on Kubernetes, that was really the least of our problems. So we kind of quickly fell into the category of what's now commonly known as day 2 problems. Basically, it was starting to slow us down in terms of just the orchestration for the development process, getting development environments up and running tests across multiple services. So I set about first looking for, and actually continuously looking for solutions to that problem. While, and I didn't find any, and it turns out they just didn't really exist, not in the form that I was hoping for. So I kind of cobbled together some internal tooling and had lots of conversations with other CTOs and people kind of in the whole DevOps realm. Everybody doing much the same, just kind of building their own bespoke tooling to solve these problems. And with Kubernetes manifesting as kind of a good foundational layer, I started having conversations with my now co-founders, and we decided now is the time where we can actually make a product to solve this, such that, teams big and small don't have to spend their time solving the same problem separately all over the world. And seeing as almost every company now is a tech company to some degree. Like, once you go past the Späti scale of a company, you do have to have some tech involved. I just really felt that surely now that we've kind of settled on some patterns that we, as an industry think makes sense, we have some foundational technologies that we can build on top of. We shouldn't all be separately solving the same solved problems all over again. Yeah. Because the cost of not doing so, one of our investors is the CTO of Eventbrite, and he was estimating before they embarked internally on this, 10-person team working on their dev tooling, creating their own kind of internal development platform, that their developers were wasting 20-25% of their time either just waiting, reconfiguring and configuring things over and over again for different contexts, managing their own development environments.
Yep.
And that's more than a day every week out of every developer's lives who is involved in it. And if you just do the back of the napkin there, that's a huge amount of waste.
One of the things I do is one live stream I have is where I look at the developer experience of developer tools and the amount of time I waste on that stream. Second is NPM installs, and first is getting Kubernetes clusters to start. I think I spent about 20 minutes on one stream waiting for a Kubernetes cluster to start. And I mean, this was on my local laptop, of course, so not really an optimal kind of setup, but still, it's just like, this is not fun watching either. Anyway, that's
that's exactly the problem space.
I actually think in order to understand Garden a bit more, it might be useful to look at some of the features, because this kind of space, sometimes we say it and people have a different understanding of what it might mean. So the three main feature areas, three? Yeah, I see you have remote development, integration tests, and that's somewhat standard, but let's just go into that a little bit. Is that integration tests, is that running on Garden, or is that you just trigger them running elsewhere? What's the case there?
So the way that it works, so Garden is, it's you can describe it as a hybrid between a development tool and an automation tool. So an automation tool, in a sense, similar to what you would set up as a CI pipeline, describing all the different steps in terms of building, deploying, testing, and then we take that, and you can actually run Garden on both sides, like on the CI side or the CD side, as locally.
I should probably finish the paragraph. I didn't, and then
sure.
And no, it was my fault. And do it all from a remote development cluster, no more Docker or Kubernetes on your laptop. So you're actually, and is there some kind of IDE extension, or there will be, or something like that?
We've thought about that, but so that's, we have to. Making those choices. We think that's an interesting notion, but we also, that's one of the areas where we don't really want to be too opinionated.
Okay.
We could certainly imagine having a VS Code extension that kind of integrates neatly with Garden, and for everybody using VS Code, it's a value add. But we certainly don't want to pin you to a specific development environment.
Yeah.
So kind of, describing what it is that it does. Basically, you have a CLI tool. You run commands like Garden deploy, Garden test this particular module, and the way you configure it, you have a little bit of configuration next to each part of your stack. So you have various different services. We have one user, a bank in the UK. They have one project with 250 different modules, and they can then deploy and test all of that in one go. And Garden will compile that all into a dependency graph. You have everything declare what it depends on. And that means every time you run, say, Garden deploy or Garden test, we figure out what has actually changed, what needs to be retested, redeployed. And you can do that from your CI pipeline or while you're developing. And in both cases, generally, you can actually run it like with a local Kubernetes or local Docker.
Yeah.
Some people do that, and for some that's fine. Maybe at a certain
especially
small scale
or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. But we like to focus on companies with somewhat more complex problems and larger environments, or some companies aren't even allowed to run Docker on your machines. So we interface, basically, we just through the Kubernetes API, do the builds. We do the builds in cluster and use a registry as a cache and for the built images. And the testing also happens in the cluster. So you deploy your project into a namespace, and then the tests, whether they're unit tests or something else, they run within that same namespace. And the benefit then is that you don't have to do mocking or stubbing, except in some small, in certain cases, you may have slight variations between production and development and things like that. But the idea is that you can actually write integration and end-to-end tests. You can use whatever tools we see Cypress being used, for example. And then that just runs within the cluster in a production-like environment. And then you can really, a lot of people are talking about testing in production, which I think is also fine, certainly not mutually exclusive. But there's a lot of things that you just have to be sure that this works before you try and push to production. Yeah. So Garden makes that a lot easier.
It's interesting because in a strange kind of way, it reminds me of some older ways that we used to develop. But this is actually often the problem I found with Kubernetes is it's like reinventing the old in a more complicated way. Sometimes it feels like it actually feels like the way back in the day when I first started doing development myself, and it was mostly lamp stacks, and getting that running on a local machine was often problematic, and we ended up with things like Vagrant and stuff like that. and you would sometimes connect to remote services to do that, and sometimes on production. It bizarrely feels a little bit similar, strangely, in some ways, but obviously it's torn up, torn down, reproducible, etc. It's a little different, but
No, I think like technological evolution, much like any other evolution, it doesn't just go like straight shot in the right direction. It's always this like back and forth, and really like the way things evolve is like a spiral between, you start lamenting all the drawbacks of having a monolith, and then you go like everything should be microservices, and then you kind of overdo it, and then go actually I want my monolith back, and and it's like I wish I were in a relationship, but no I want to be single again, and it's like you're always this tug of war with yourself, and I'm quite pleased in my relationship. I don't know what I'm talking about, but
I mean more generally. I've been married for 12 years. I mean more generally. So, okay, let's get off that subject before we go down those paths. And then the QA and code review. Actually, this is something that a few more platforms are also doing. I think GitLab. There's actually another Berlin startup that does something similar. That every time you create a PR or a merge request, you get an ephemeral preview environment, much like production, or as much as like production as you want it to be, and people can do sort of real world tests. Is there anything particularly specific or special with Garden there, or is it much like some of the other offerings there in that case?
I mean, so these are all kind of use cases of the same general core principle, which is that you're able to spin up these production-like environments as you work. So you can do that while you're just iterating on your code, and then you commit and push to Git, and then an environment is set up there where the integration test can run for sure, but also it's the same sort of environment that you had during development that is then very similar to, you're basically not. It reduces the instances of why does this work locally and not in CI, because you're actually using the same configuration, and then you can attach. You can either do it yourself with. So Garden Core is a CLI tool. You can run it from your CI pipelines to spin up these environments and keep them alive while the PR is open. Garden Enterprise is a commercial product. I'm not going to go all salesy here, but that,
I was going to get to those next, so you're leading me in nicely. So yeah.
Sure. Okay. But that's, that has direct integration with GitHub and GitLab, so it can spin up these environments and maintain for the lifecycle of a PR, for example. Yeah. And then the use case being that, your colleagues who are reviewing the PR, who are doing the testing, your QA folks, they get an environment that is as similar to production as is viable for these ad hoc ephemeral environments. So basically what these use cases that you went through there, they are all use cases of essentially the same thing. It's not like we have specific features for QA. It's more to do with exposing these types of environments to all these different stakeholders.
Yeah, and the ability, I suppose, I did see something here about mobile and stuff like that, which has often been notoriously difficult to test. So being able to do that in a realistic-ish environment is a big positive.
Exactly.
Just drilling a bit more into the two additions and some of the features. Some of them are more clear than others. Mentioned a couple here. Remote sources. What's a remote source?
Right. Yeah. So I suppose that's an instance of our kind of internal terminology bleeding into the marketing copy. But a remote source is basically you can compile a single Garden project out of multiple Git repositories. Okay. Garden will fetch them on demand and provide some tools to keep them updated. It's analogous to Git submodules, but has some benefits in that it is a little bit more Garden native. And we see actually some people use Git submodules, some people but you can also have your Garden configuration separate from your application code. And then you just like this Garden module, the sources are in this repository, and then Garden will fetch that for you.
Okay. Hopefully less mess than Git submodules.
Yeah, we try, and we're actually working out some improvements in terms of how we, especially once you have lots of different repositories, we've been thinking a lot about how we can facilitate that. And that's exactly, the type of problem that Garden aims to help with. It's the kind of orchestration between lots of different code repositories and configurations and stitching it all together.
And on the subject of stitching, so you mentioned here Terraform integration. Yeah. What do you use Terraform for, and is that the only option? Can people use other options?
So Garden is pluggable. We haven't yet published a plugin SDK. We do have that, on kind of tentative roadmap. But for now, we're just kind of working it out ourselves. And certainly, Garden being open source, people can contribute plugins. But we went with Terraform because it's by some stretch the most popular choice for infrastructure automation. And the way that it works, you basically you can have a Terraform project in the Garden project root, or you can declare a module that has some Terraform stack. And the benefit then, and you can then put that in the dependency graph along with everything else that's in your Kubernetes application. So a simple example would be, say you justifiably don't want to run Postgres in your Kubernetes cluster, which I would generally advise against if you can avoid it, except for development. And what you can then do, say just for the production or the staging environment or both, you can have a Terraform module that deploys a Cloud SQL instance or an RDS instance or whichever cloud provider you're using, and that the outputs from that Terraform stack are then available in templating across all your different other modules. So you have some API services or something that require that database. You can declare the provisioning for the database and then template all the outputs into the rest of your provide that to the Kubernetes services. And obviously that goes for anything that Terraform supports. There is an example in a repository where we actually deploy a GKE cluster as part of the Garden project. From experience, we see less of people using that approach, but certainly possible. So basically, but it kind of speaks to how we've designed Garden. Garden actually is sort of unique amongst these Kubernetes dev tools in that it is not tied to the hip to Kubernetes fundamentally. Yeah,
you mentioned containers as well. I mean, that's somewhat related, but yeah, that's where else do you? I suppose I cut you off a little bit. First question is why, how, I guess, and secondly, where else do you see it going?
Sure. Well, so the how is basically we decided not to make Kubernetes primitives native to Garden necessarily. So we wanted it to be more adaptable to different scenarios. The why is, well, I think I sometimes quip that, Kubernetes is like yesterday's technology tomorrow. It definitely, it is a very sensible path from legacy systems into the cloud because, and it provides a lot of flexibility, but it also carries a lot of that baggage. Like we're still thinking about ports. We're still thinking about kind of low-level networking things. And I imagine fast forward, I don't know how many years, we'll be looking to get off of Kubernetes. And the last thing I would want to do is to build another tool that you're then going to have to replace and uproot. I would rather, whenever, the next evolution happens, and even just somewhere along the way, one thing that we've been eyeing is maybe having Lambda as one of the supported module types. So you could deploy, I suppose you can technically do that with Terraform today already, but it's kind of not great in terms of developer experience. But we could directly support Lambda functions alongside your normal Kubernetes resources, so you can mix and match like say if you want to have like Cloudflare edge workers, we can fashion a plugin for that. And we're really just waiting for people to ask us to do it. And we're like a fairly small operation, so we have to be conscious with our time, that's all. But you know, with an eye to the future, I think this is going to be very important to be able to mix and match and yet have the same overarching development tooling and automation tooling. And that's the why. I think that's
it's actually interesting. I mean, now we have definitely on the path of hybrid cloud, but generally using the same tool to connect it all. So why not hybrid cloud orchestrator?
Right.
That's quite complicated, but yeah. Who knows? Maybe Mesos will make a comeback, you know. So, etc. And things like that. Or maybe people just want to connect monoliths to each other again. Who knows?
Sure.
So just to continue down some of the feature list here, one you say in-cluster building. I'm guessing that's just building in the cluster. That's pretty self-explanatory.
Fairly, Like mostly, I mean, you can run a Docker daemon in the cluster, which is quite performant for a small, you know, a single user or a small team. But Kaneko is kind of our preferred. You have some options there. And basically, we synchronize the sources between your local machine and the cluster and run the build from there.
Okay. And then, so this is where the features in Core stop. And is Core open source, or is that just free, or is there a bit of a...
Core is open source, yes.
Okay. And then on the enterprise version, you add events and log collection. That seems reasonable. You can't really do that in an open source version, neither should you. Secrets management, pretty similar reason. Centralized environment management, again, pretty similar. Now, the one here that gets interesting, direct integration with VCA, with version control system. So if I'm running Core, what do I do? Does it just mean I have to do it myself, or...
Yeah, so Garden Core is basically a CLI tool. You run that from your developer machine, you run it from CI, run it from wherever, but you're basically operating it yourself. And there is no persistent state anywhere. So Garden Enterprise is, and it's actually, we got the feedback that we shouldn't really have the compare editions thing because they're entirely separate products, really. It's a completely separate code base. Because Garden Enterprise...
That's actually worth mentioning in itself, because from what you said and from what I read, I think open core, etc., which is controversial. So, there's other reasons to maybe.
No, I think it's worth making that clear in our copy there, because we expressly did not want to go like kind of like dual license sort of a model where we have kind of a sort of a handicapped version of the same thing, but rather the enterprise product is this kind of management and governance layer on top. And the way that it works, you basically deploy that in a Kubernetes cluster somewhere within your infrastructure. And we felt that was important because most of the companies that we talk to, they have to run things within their own infra. They can't use a SaaS thing. They mostly like are running like GitHub Enterprise or GitLab usually in their VPCs, but in the occasional on-prem. And then basically when you use Garden as you would otherwise normally, it's still configured the same way. Like all you do is add a tiny bit of metadata to your project, and then you do a Garden login, you log into the enterprise instance, and then everything that you do is reported back there. And that means Garden has the latest information about all the workflows that you're running, service statuses, test results, things of that sort. And the VCS integration basically means instead of you running directly through your CI system, which you can still do, you get those like Garden checks in your PR, and we will automatically run whichever workflows you've configured to be triggered on, say, pull request open, pull request change, whatever events that you want to act on.
Nice. So let's move on to the company a little bit. So just about 3 weeks ago, you announced 3.1.
Yeah, I know.
Anyway, euros in seed funding, and enterprise goes GA. We've talked a little bit about enterprise. I mean, for a seed round, that's fairly reasonable. Let's just go back a step. So how long has the company existed?
It started beginning of 2018.
Okay.
And like early on, we got a pre-seed round, and that included a fund based out of here in Berlin called Fly Ventures, and some smaller ones, System One, Tiny VC, and a long list of angel investors, actually.
Actually, and there's some quite interesting ones here. Chad Fowler, who used to live here in Berlin, mostly known for Wunderlist, which is kind of now gone. And Nat Friedman, co-founder of GitHub, which is kind of interesting. And
he's a CEO of GitHub, actually. I don't think.
Yeah, I feel like he might have been. I can't remember. But also some interesting angel investors from companies like Datadog, Unity, which is an interesting one, and some more local companies too that people probably won't have heard of. But so what do you think people have seen in what they've seen?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, it was a bad wording. So it is sort of relatively early days, but you've worked on a product pretty quickly, and a reasonably good seed round from some pretty kind of solid names there. So what do you think people see in Garden that's promising, that shows promise?
So I think the key thing is that it's a widely recognized problem, like everything that we've been talking about in terms of, it's a developer experience and a developer productivity, and the scale of the problem. Like if people are by and large wasting a day plus of every week, and developers are not the cheapest labor, I think that and so I think, it immediately catches people's eye, and like Chad Fowler, obviously very technical himself, and Renaud, CTO of Eventbrite, has been experienced this problem hands on themselves. And I don't know, I think it kind of helped that I exited a company previously. I think it kind of, meant that the reception was a little bit, quicker, I guess. And that it's not just credentials, it's actually like that experience has been tremendously useful. Your first burnout teaches you a lot, little things like that. I think the problem is very clear. I think when we started, we had a prototype, we had a notion of what we were doing, and actually the design and the architecture has held up through this whole time. And then the challenge that has followed is to figure out, like, who are we selling to? Like, because this is a very big problem space. We're not going to solve all of it. So what are we going to focus on? Where do we focus our time? This never-ending pursuit of product market fit is what has followed alongside just the technical challenges of getting this right. But I think, people very early on picked up that, this is a problem worth solving. No question there. The market is there for sure. The question that, we're always continuously aiming to answer is our approach the right approach? Are we the team to do it? And are we focusing in the right way? And that's the challenge.
With regards to focus, I'd just like to talk a little bit about on the open source side, because I'm just digging around your GitHub and I find some quite nice things, like you have homebrew packages. I go around contributing homebrew packages for so many things.
Oh yeah?
Because I want them. It's quite nice to see. And a lot of other quite positive things I see through the way your engineers commit and commit messages and things like that. So you mentioned that people can write plugins. Do you have kind of a way of doing that, or is it still a little bit?
We're not really pushing for the. Okay. We're not really pushing for the community to contribute those, because we do those internally mostly. We've had people contribute to the plugins that we already have. Okay. But we decided, we had the early ambition to have an open plugin SDK, and then we just decided as we kind of picked that problem apart, we didn't want to make a plugin SDK and then put ourselves in a corner with respect to the implementation. So we're letting it mature a little bit, slowly peeling things out of the core code base. And then the time will come where it will be much easier to build plugins.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we're also adding more just capabilities to the framework itself, so that it's also from feedback. Lots of our users, these tend to be kind of on the more advanced users tend to be on the kind of I hate to use the term DevOps engineer, but that is kind of what I'm describing.
Yeah.
People who are working on automation and infrastructure, managing pipelines, and they really just want to be able to weave their own scripts and not have to actually write TypeScript, which is a slightly unusual choice as well. So I think we're rather just building features for them to be able to extend within their own local context, as opposed to contribute like some somewhat elaborate plugin to support AWS Lambda or something.
Well, that explains why you have 2 Microsoft employees interested. It's TypeScript. That was a joke. Right. Okay, so you've talked quite a bit there about focus, and that was actually kind of leading into my question around the open source thing. But looking into the future, what's on the roadmap for the next 6 months or so?
So we've been basically focusing a lot on getting the enterprise product into the hands of the first few users. Since we announced it, and we had people kicking the tires, as it were, until we did the announcement just some weeks ago. So that's a big part of what we're focusing on. That said, it's not to say that we're abandoning the open source side, because those are 2 products that are tightly intertwined, and one supports the other. I, in my very limited spare time for development, sometimes contribute on the open core. And what we're looking to do with the commercial product is to have it collect and present a lot more information than it does today. We're looking into what would be useful analytics for developers to have in a platform like that. Okay. Like understanding, especially for a large project, it's really good to see which tests are failing the most, which are slowing down pipelines, which builds could be optimized, things of that sort. We're also focusing a bit on really just enabling features, because a lot of the times it's like one of these things that we learn as we go, because it's easy to think from a startup's perspective, you just want the tools and you could just tell your team to use them. But for larger companies, like some of the very big US companies that we're talking to, in what I'm sure will be a long sales process, which is fine. It's complicated, but they have to think so much about this whole governance aspect, and how do you actually provision accounts for everybody? It needs to be integrated with SSO. It needs to be you need to have like tightly defined roles. Who's allowed to deploy to this environment and not that environment. So we're kind of
small, scrappy startups tend to overlook in the first place, because
that's the thing. So that's why it's
we just want to move quickly.
Exactly. So I think like if you fast forward maybe through next year, it's we have so many ideas and things that we want to do, and this space is there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. But for now, key thing is to make sure that powerful tool like Garden can be rolled out for a large organization in reliable, compliance policy friendly sort of a way. There's also security features. I think these days in enterprise land, it's all about shifting left, and that is actually something that we're really behind, and we want to do some more integrations with security software. So, for example, one very tedious part of working at a large organization is if you're working on your code, you think you're done, you push it, it's even merged, and then sometime later a security process finds some problem with it, and it turns out like you're just not allowed to use that base image, or you're not allowed to run that piece of software. And you want to discover these things very early in the process. So integrating vulnerability scanners. We already have a plugin for a tool called ConfTest, where you can apply policies, like OPA style policies. And then you know very early in the process whether you're breaking some of those policies or you're introducing vulnerabilities. So that's part of what we're emphasizing over the next 6 months as well.
That was my interview with Jon Edvald of Garden. Okay, now a few updates from me. So what's new from me? First up, I did a solo adventure session last Friday on Quill, a letter writing roleplay game. Sounds kind of weird, but actually these work quite well because they're short and kind of suit maybe the format a bit better. And my newsletter change plans took an unexpected turn because I was using Review and was thinking of switching away from it because the cost versus what I was getting out of the newsletter wasn't worth it. And then they announced they just got bought out by Twitter and have made it free. So I may continue using it. I'm not sure yet. But the other topic newsletters that you can actually start subscribing to up on my newsletters tab up here, I'm still testing, but I'm very nearly ready to go. And you can see some of the specific topics here. Gaming, ethics, and language. They're coming very soon. Dexpose has been taking a slight break because I'm actually about to relaunch that with splitting it out into 2 different streams, actually, interestingly. So watch out for that soon. Possibly the first of those will be starting next Monday the 1st of February, actually, at, I think, 15:30 Central European time. So keep an eye out for that, and it'll be slightly different. And then we're continuing from there, actually splitting out into 2 new streams. I think that's about all from a kind of broad... Oh, yes, if you are thinking of attending FOSDEM, quote-unquote attending FOSDEM this year, then I am co-organising the Tool the Docs Dev Room again. We'll be running on Sunday the 7th afternoon. I've bought a big stash of Belgian beers, so you can join us for the socials before and afterwards, and we can cheers each other across the internet. Yeah, do what you can right now, I suppose. And that is about all for now. I'm actually going to have a lot of new things to announce very soon. I'm just getting slots in calendars, so some more updates very, very soon. Kind of in timing with what I mentioned earlier about the Week This Week, also changing formats a little bit, so watch this space. But until then, if you have been, thank you very, very much for watching or listening or reading, and I will see you next time.